You're listening to Mental Health Unplugged, Grabbing the Ox. Mental Health Unplugged
is a growing community of young adult and youth leaders in Illinois with an interest in mental health. And this is the podcast, brought to you by NAMI Illinois, the National Alliance of Mental Illness Illinois State Organization. This podcast features conversations with the Mental Health
Unplugged
work group, with guests and spotlights on topics that matter to us. This work group focuses on creating and applying innovative strategies that involve 3 pillars: anti-stigma, advocacy, and building a community of support, providing the voice to emphasize the youth and young adult perspective. Disclaimer: we are not psychiatrists, clinicians, and we are not social workers, but we are experts in our own experience with mental health and wellness. We call this living experience. Our expertise are developed from our experiences as individuals, as young people, and our passions. Everyone has mental health. You are not alone, and more than enough. It's time to act and talk about it. Let's do this. Hey, yay! Welcome to
Mental Health Unplugged.
Hello. This is Mental Health Unplugged, Grabbing the Ox, a youth and young adult mental health and wellness podcast. I'm the host for today, Arielle H. And for this episode, we want to talk about advocacy, what it can look like, how you can get involved, all that good stuff. So oftentimes when people think about advocating, one of the first things that comes to mind is voting, especially during election times like this year. Voting is wonderful and a great way to participate in government. I encourage everyone 18 years and older to exercise their right to vote and research candidates that best align with your ideals. However, voting is not the only way for young people, or any people for that matter, to advocate, especially advocating for mental health. And this will be the bulk of our discussion today. Okay. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today, Mental Health Unplugged members Arielle J and Teklii D. Why don't you guys come say hello?
Hi, I'm Arielle J. It's nice to be here.
Teklii D. Excited to be here as well.
Thank you for being here. And we are also joined today by Lily Rocha, the Associate Vice President of Policy at NAMI Chicago. She has worked in policy as a mental health advocate for years and is generously joining us today to share her knowledge. Thank you, Lily.
Yeah, thank you for having me on today.
So since we have you here, Lily, I'd like to first ask you to maybe explain what advocacy is and possibly share some examples.
Yeah, that's a great question because we talk about it so much. It's just helpful for us to have a working definition. I would say that advocacy is speaking out for change. So you see something that's not quite working and you want to do something about it. You take some sort of action or you speak out for what you would like to see. And I think that's advocacy. What's really cool is that it comes in so many different forms. And so advocating can be like voting, right? You could be like, I don't like the way that this person is managing this work or leading this team. I am voting for somebody else because I want to see a change. It could also be, protesting, like marching on the streets. If you feel like there's something that you feel so passionate about that you want to join with others and be loud, that's also a form of advocacy. It's also writing to your congressman and being like, hey, I don't like this, what's going on here. I really want to see a change and I need you as my elected official to go ahead and do something about it. So I think what's cool is that it can take so many different forms and it looks so differently. And it's also just kind of dependent on your time and your personality style, right? There's some folks who maybe are a little bit more shy and are more willing to do online activism and send emails. And then there are some folks who like to maybe be a little bit louder and do some public speaking. So I think it's really cool that there's so many different opportunities. And then I encourage everybody to find the right style that fits them.
Okay, cool. Very cool. What, in your opinion, Lily, is like a really good way for specifically young people to kind of get started in advocacy work?
Yeah, there's so many great ways. I mean, one of the easiest ways right now is to just, register to vote and exercise that vote. But I think another way that folks can also get involved in advocacy and do work that they really want to pursue is just be able to talk to your legislators. And I think it can feel really scary, or it could feel like something intimidating, right? When you're like, I don't know who to talk to. I don't know what I would say. I don't know what I would talk about. But I would say just, find who your elected officials are. We actually have on NAMI Chicago a policy center, one of our web pages, and you can find who your elected official is. So you can easily go on there, type in your address, and it'll give you the name and contact information for all your elected officials. And I would say it's something just being like, hey, like I want to talk to you about this, or here's how I'm feeling about this, and here's what I would like for you to do. I think can be scary sometimes being like, I don't know what the solution is, but that's their job, right? Your job is to kind of come up with like the reality and the solutions and the big changes that you'd like to see. And then that's their job to take on the details and figure out how to do that. So definitely say, registering to vote, taking time to find out who your elected officials are and contacting them. It's a really great way. And then I think lastly is just being plugged in with a lot of the advocacy that's going on. So, for example, signing up for NAMI Illinois and NAMI Chicago's websites and newsletters and following them on social media, because there's so many advocacy organizations that often help people take action by, having forms that they can fill out, by having advocacy days. And so being able to tap into that where there's a lot of people, it's going to be really awesome and really helpful in someone's advocacy journey.
I would love to learn more about how to get involved with that, but I have a question. What do you mean by online activism?
Yeah, so sometimes, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but sometimes there'll be forms that folks will send out, like different advocacy organizations, be like, we want to take action and we want you to fill out this form and send it to your congressmen and to your senators and to your elected officials. And so oftentimes it'll be a form letter that this advocacy organization has created, and all you have to do is plug in your address and your name, and then it sends it to your elected officials. It's really a great, easy way to kind of take action right then and there. I will say the most effective is probably just calling directly and unprompted and doing it on your own. But I think for folks who may not have that much time or who don't know where to start, following a lot of advocacy organizations who have these action alerts and taking action and actually filling out the form, it's a really great way to get started.
Very cool. How do we advocate outside of quote unquote voting season or voting period?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just having those constant conversations with your elected officials always I will always, talk about that, and I'll bring it up every point I can because I have to underscore how important that is. I think the other thing too is just starting to observe patterns and noticing issues and wherever you work. I think sometimes people feel like they have to have like a legal background or write legislation or, know how government works and to be able to take action, and that's just not true. What makes somebody an effective advocate is that they have lived experience or that they have firsthand experience with the issue. So, if you're talking about mental health, if you're somebody with lived mental health experience, you know how the system worked for you. Like you're that subject matter expert on your own experience. And then the other thing too is, for any folks who are like, I don't know how to like even bring up the conversation, just start sharing your story. What happened to you? What was it that you saw? Like, what was your own experience? There's so much value in being able to bring your firsthand experience into the conversation because we need facts and numbers and data, right? Like we need those to be able to create good policy. At the same time, like these firsthand experiences are just as valuable because they bring really the human element of this, and it helps us remind us that we're not just dealing with numbers and abstract ideas, we're dealing with everyday people who are encountering these issues.
Is that included in kind of the work that you do at NAMI Chicago, or is that totally separate? Like what is kind of your work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy for NAMI Chicago. Chicago is an affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, just like NAMI Illinois is an affiliate as well. And so we're the Chicago affiliate for NAMI. So at NAMI Chicago, I work with our entire organization, many of which are mental health providers themselves. It could be peer ambassadors, 988 counselors, helpline counselors, clinical support team members. And so I work with them to figure out what are some of the challenges that we're seeing in the system. And then how do I bring that up to decision makers? And then how do I work with decision makers to make sure that the solutions that we're coming up with, the ideas that we're coming up with are tied to reality and are what people actually need. So I really see myself almost as like a conduit and a connector between elected officials, decision makers, and the folks on the ground doing the work, as well as with many of folks in our community who have a mental illness themselves or have a family member with a mental illness. And so my job is to kind of help decision makers mostly at the state, local, and county level really figure out like what are the mental health needs that we need and what does it look like to make sure that we're providing them.
So you said that you worked or you encouraged people to go talk with their legislative representatives, but how do we get involved with that? Or how do we get involved with bill writing and talking to them? And what are like the first steps that we can take to start doing that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways to go about it. You could do, again, sign up for newsletters and information from organizations that often take folks to meet with their legislators. But you on your own, if you want to just start meeting with them, step one is Google them. Like Google, who is my elected official, right? And then you enter in your information, you get that contact information. The next step is to call or email them and then say, hey, I am a constituent. It's really important to say that you're a constituent. Constituent is a person who lives in the area that the elected official represents. So basically, you're saying, like, I'm a voter, I matter, like, you should listen to me. Say, hi, my name is Lily. I'm a constituent. I want to talk to you about, mental health care and how inadequate it is. Could I schedule a time to talk to you about it? There's also folks who may not feel comfortable with like scheduling that one-on-one time and just want to send an email or leave a message with their staff. And so I think that's when you can call or email and say, hi, my name is Lily. I'm a constituent. I have like firsthand experience with the mental health system, and I had a lot of challenges, and here's where it didn't work for me. This didn't work, and this didn't work, and this didn't work. And as an elected official, I want you to make it better. I want people to be able to like access healthcare easily. I want it to be affordable. I wanted to be culturally competent. I wanted to work in a way that it didn't work for me. And then sometimes I like to end with a question for them because it kind of has that like accountability mechanism built in there where you can ask like, so what are you going to do about it? Or, so what's your plan to make it better? Or could you let me know what your thoughts are on improving the mental health system? So I think that's a really easy way. It is one, just Google them, find out where they are. Two, get their contact information. Three, call and or email them. And four, share your story and your thoughts. I think it's scary when folks are like, I have to write a bill, I have to know legalese. No, absolutely not. That's their job. They have staff that do that. Your job is just to come up with the reality and share your experience and what you're seeing, and then share with them your vision of what you'd like to see better. And then they'll work on that ideally. You may have some legislators who are more responsive than others, right? And it could be for a variety of reasons. And I think then the conversation is then like, how do I get my elected official to care about this more? And oftentimes it's with numbers, right? So if you talk to your friends and you talk to your network and you're like, hey, let's get this on this person's radar. If you get one call, they might be able to ignore the call and be like, whatever, it was one constituent. But if they're getting 20, 30 people calling about this, it's really hard for them to ignore it and be like, oh, I don't have to think about it. Like, no, yes, you do. These are your constituents are speaking out about something. You have to address it in some way, shape, or form. So, I definitely encourage people to think about doing it with friends and with family and, making that impact together.
I appreciate that. I feel like there's a lot of stigma around sharing your personal stories, especially when it comes to trying to represent yourself and your story to representatives. Because a lot of people will say, oh, you're just sharing your sob story and you're just doing it for pity points or like something like that. But it sounds like it is really important to the conversation with our legislators. Can you speak
Yeah,
to that? I just
absolutely.
feel
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally recognize that there's a lot of weight that comes with sharing your story and you may not want to leave it on a voicemail, right? So I think it's also being able to have that you have complete control over your story and what you share and what you don't share. So I always tell people it's completely up to you what you want to say, when you want to say it, how often you want to say it. So one day you're with someone and you open up and you tell everything and it's extremely intimate, that's okay. That if the next day you go talk to another legislator and you don't want to talk, like that's totally fine. That's up to you, right? You have that right. What I will say sometimes is that might help is maybe having different versions of your story, like a shorter one, a more detailed one, and then like a longer one for when you feel more comfortable. So you might not necessarily, if you were hospitalized, you may not necessarily be ready to talk about it yet, but you could say something like, I've struggled with mental health and depression, and I've needed resources and they weren't there for me. But then, maybe you want to add a little bit more detail in your next meeting. You could say, I had depression during this time in my life. It was really bad. And it got to the point where my mom had to call a hospital and get me, hospitalized, and I needed inpatient care. And so, you can again have those like different versions of your story and recognizing that you can also change it as you're talking, right? So maybe you're talking and you're feeling like the legislator or the elected official isn't quite listening to you, or you don't feel like they're being as receptive as you'd like, you can always pull back a little bit and just say, I don't need to delve more into it, to just let you know that like the issues were systemic. I saw them here, and I really want to urge you to, take action on these items. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of stigma, and I hope, one day we can get to a place where we're all more comfortable talking about our mental health struggles, just like we can say like, oh, I, broke my foot. You could be like, oh yeah, I do have OCD or I'm bipolar, and we can be like, oh, okay. And I'm kind of just like, cool, like I hope you get treatment and wish you the best. And it's an issue that I know you're working on and managing. I don't know that we're quite there yet. And so until we get there, I think it might be helpful to kind of just have different versions of your story for your sake and, for yourself, really.
I had kind of in relation to that question on like the fear of reaching out completely on your own. Like somebody might just be like, I'm going to email this legislator, right? But I imagine doing that completely by yourself is scary. So how would you recommend people find other people to then have a whole clan of people to say, listen to us, we're a whole group, it's not just one single person?
Yeah, I mean, definitely putting in a shameless plug for NAMI Chicago and our advocacy listserv. We definitely have advocacy opportunities there, where we recently had one for 988 where we all got together on Zoom and in person, and we called our legislators, we emailed them, we wrote out some postcards and sent them out. So, that was a really awesome way to take action collectively and not feel like, any one of us was doing it on their own. I will say that the other thing that you also want to be mindful of is that you can, find folks through peer support groups, through other avenues where you're sharing your story and you're getting that mental health help. There could be a lot of other folks that you're talking to, and not just sharing, your personal story, but you're also sharing the struggles. And you're like, yeah, that is messed up that it's so expensive to, afford this treatment. And we should talk about this. And so I think there's also that community, even with folks who are going through the same journey as you. So if you're able to share that and open up, I think and encourage folks to be like, we should probably do something about this. Like, let's talk to our legislators. And again, it seems like a little silly or like counterintuitive, depending on how much faith you have, in the government to work. But I always say that it's a long game. It's going to take a long time. It's not always going to be easy. It's not going to be fast, but it does need to happen at some point, and it does require people to constantly push and push and push towards progress. I mean, I think the other thing, lastly, I'll say is like you can find communities online as well of like different mental health groups or advocates who are taking action, and being able to plug into them is really awesome. So, there's different avenues I think where you can find folks, but yeah, social media is one area where you can find those networks and connect with people, as well as, through NAMI Chicago and our advocacy network. And then just, in real life, when you're talking to other folks who are going through the lived mental health experience, such as either peer support groups, or maybe you're just talking to your friends, or maybe you're just talking to some coworkers after work and you're all kind of realizing that you're kind of sharing similar stories. And maybe there's something there that you can latch onto and decide to take action collectively.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing. That was awesome. I know I heard you talk about advocacy fatigue, which I imagine can happen if you're working nonstop to talk to legislators and advocate for mental health. But you reminded me of that when you were talking about like being in a group and like doing it together. So can you talk more a bit on what advocacy fatigue is and kind of how you might be able to combat it?
Yeah, I sometimes see advocacy fatigue in folks who have advocated for an issue for a while, and they're not either seeing a ton of progress or any progress, or they might just feel unheard. And that's real. It happens sometimes where, again, I mentioned like for changing systems, it's going to take years, maybe decades, and we're not going to see it right away. So there are times, even myself, when I feel a little burnt out, where I'm like, oh my God, like we're going back, we're talking to the legislature again about this issue. Again, we're doing it like hopefully this time we'll get a little bit further, right? So there is that sense of like there's some advocacy fatigue there in general. And I encourage folks to take a step back and take a moment if they need it. And I think there's so much work to do here long term that I would rather folks be like, you know what, I'm not going to share my story or talk to legislators anymore. I did it for maybe a month or two, talked to a few people, but honestly, I'm just not feeling great about it. I'd rather that person kind of just step aside, take the time that they need, feel better, feel like they're a little bit recovered, have a little bit more stamina, and then can come back and continue advocating versus them push, 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 and then they get jaded, and then they don't want to do this ever again, and then they just completely leave and never come back, right? So I encourage people to take a break whenever they need it and just make sure that they're taking care of themselves. Like for myself, sometimes it's a little bit of like, okay, I'm gonna focus on some other work for for a little bit for the next week or two because like I just can't fully engage in this right now. And it also helps to kind of have a community of folks that you can sometimes vent with or talk to. And sometimes it's nice to talk to other advocates and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, we only got a little bit of what we asked for. It can be demoralizing, but sometimes just a little bit of that venting can feel good. Because at least for me, like after I vent, I'm like, okay, but at least we got somewhere, right? At least we're a little bit better than we were yesterday and like we're getting somewhere. So that also leads me to more, I guess, gratitude for the work that we're doing. So yeah, it definitely happens and encourage folks to take a break if they need it.
Do you ever feel guilty for needing to take a break from advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at some point maybe I did, like earlier on, like constantly feeling like I have to always be pushing for something. And especially, for me, a lot of this work is my 9 to 5. So there's also like a bit of an inability to fully pull away. But I think what I've been feeling better about now is that realizing that I want to do this long term and that I'm taking care of myself by being able to set up some healthy boundaries from time to time. So I think kind of reframing it that way as more of like self-care for the long haul has made me feel a little bit better and alleviated a little bit of that guilt. There can always be more, but recognizing that I am, one person, I'm doing what I can, and that I'm human, and sometimes I need a little break, and that's okay. So, yeah, it's definitely taken me a little bit to get there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I was also to ask if you have any suggestions on how we can encourage and support young people in their advocacy journeys.
Yeah, I definitely think that one way that folks, younger folks can, get more involved in their advocacy work is by, talking to their teachers and mentors that they have about getting involved. Oftentimes on campus, there will be either student groups or student government who does get involved with a lot of activities in terms of advocacy. So that's a really great avenue. And I think a lot of times our teachers and advisors, professors, they can be really good at helping you figure out what the landscape is and what you need to do to get there. I think the other thing too is, just start if you're on social media, it can be a lot. It can be very heavy and it can at sometimes not feel great. So encouraging you to find the space that does feel good for you and building community that way and figuring out where there are advocacy opportunities. I think, again, registering to vote is a really easy way to get started and become more civically engaged. And then, of course, continuing to vote. One of the things that I didn't really fully realize until kind of working in the space a little bit more is just how important it is to vote, but vote frequently. The more you vote, the more outsized importance you have to your elected officials because their job is to not only get people to vote for them, but get the people who tend to vote to actually to go to the polls and vote for them, right? If you've never voted, if you're not registered to vote, you're not really someone that an elected official has an incentive to listen to. And again, that's not because of malice or on their end, like they just don't like you. It's because it's a bit of a numbers game. They need to win a certain number of votes to win an election. So they need to go after people who are voters. The way you become one of those people is to, well, vote and vote consistently. So definitely encourage people to, start on their voting journey wherever you can, and voting not only for our presidential elections, right? We know this November there's a big presidential election, but there's municipal elections, there's city council, there's governor elections, there's school board elections at so many levels. The more local, the smaller the election is, the more impact your vote has. So definitely keep voting.
Yeah, voting is fun and
know.
advocacy work is fun. And I love the emphasis on community and impact. I really do.
I'd also like to get your thoughts on how advocacy might look different in different communities, especially in communities of color.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. In various communities, in particular, I think communities of color, there's a lot of inherent distrust, and I think warranted distrust in government and in it working for you and your community. I know, myself, I'm Mexican American, and I often heard a lot of disparaging comments about government, how it doesn't work, and how it's very corrupt. And I think that came from a lot of my parents' experience in Mexico, where there is a lot of rampant corruption, right? And there are many other communities who also face a lot of racism and prejudice. For example, in African American communities, there's a lot of just distrust that comes from, remnants of racism and that come from slavery and that come from those systems that oppressed them for centuries. And that's rightfully so. And so I also want to be mindful that I tell people to advocate, knowing that there are many people who carry a lot of like skepticism and a lot of heavy burdens about their interactions with the government. I look to a lot of leadership from different BIPOC folks. I look to a lot of leadership from different communities, such as the LGBTQ community, looking at folks from the disability community, and just being able to make sure that we're talking about civic engagement in a way that resonates with them and that acknowledges the realities that they have faced. And so even something simple as, making sure that voting registration forms are available in Spanish and Polish and all these languages is a really great way to just start making that accessible. So my hope is that the younger generation, I think, might be actually the most racially diverse generation in the entire history of the country. And so my hope is that that diversity leads to a lot more connections and a lot more activism from various communities.
So I'm mixed. I'm Asian American and I'm white. So can you kind of speak to the intersectionality of advocacy work and how we each have our own identity and how it relates to advocacy?
Yeah, no, and it's true, right? There are folks who may be biracial, there are folks who are Black and undocumented, there are folks who are LGBTQ and disabled. And so being able to say, hey, I'm so many of these identities and I understand what it means to have multiple barriers. It's, I think, really empowering actually, because it gives you a sense of what you need to do to make things better for everybody else. Like you have that firsthand experience of what it is like to be, a Black undocumented student in a way that nobody else does. And I think it's also powerful because you have a lot of opportunity to shed light on it. I think the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to put the onus on those folks to be like the speakers and the representatives for everybody who looks like them, right? We want to make sure that we're also being mindful that these are individual experiences and no one person is representative of a race or a community. But it does allow us to kind of just think about how people carry more than one identity. And it's really important to be mindful about all of them. And it's really important that we're creating solutions that work for all of your identities, not just one of them.
Thank you. You put that beautifully.
Lily, is there a personal example of advocacy work that you have done, whether it's professional or in your personal life, that you could share with us?
Yeah. So professionally, one of the things that I've been working on the past few years, even before I was at NAMI Chicago, I was getting more funding for mental health services on Illinois' public colleges and universities. So the public colleges and universities are funded by the state. The state creates a budget every year and it says we need X amount of dollars here, X amount of dollars there, X amount of dollars here. So my job as an advocate is to go to legislators and explain to them why we need to fund mental health services and why they need to put a lot of money towards that line item in the state budget. And so I often have conversations with legislators. I help students create their own stories go down to Springfield or talk to them on Zoom or in their district office. I help the media understand the issue, create fact sheets and make sure that folks understand what the issue is. So we go down to Springfield um, every spring, which is when the legislature is debating the budget, because they have to finalize it by the end of May, and then it goes into effect July 1st of that year, and it's in operation until June 30th of the next year. So, for example, this past spring, we were there and we were like, hey, it's really important that you fund it. Here are some of the programs that we've heard it could be fund. hear some of the impact, and also just being mindful with them that even though we're getting this money, there's still issues. And so, yeah, we're getting more money. Folks are able to hire more peer support leaders, for example, on campus. However, it's still not enough, right? We're still hearing from folks that there's a wait list to see a therapist. We're still hearing from folks that they're not able to afford some of the services that may be available. So being able to let legislators know what's happening on the ground has been really awesome. And so this year, we got funding for the third consecutive year for mental health services on college campuses. It was $13 million in the state budget for all public colleges and universities, which is a great start. And we were very excited, but I think I'd love to see more. It sounds like a lot of money, but when you think about all the colleges and universities and all the students that we have to service, it's actually not that much. And so I think I'm going to work with other advocates, with any stakeholders to make sure that we're really capturing the amount of dollars that we need for that infrastructure, and then making sure that we're making that investment with the state. I would say personally, I have advocated for myself, not even legislatively, but just as a customer and a consumer. Went to the doctor a few years ago. They thought they had found something, and I had to take another test, and it turns out they were wrong. And so it was their mistake. I never had anything. I was fine. But they still charged me for that test that they made me take. And I was pretty upset because I was like, well, no, I only did this because you messed up. I don't think that's fair. And so I kind of applied some of my advocacy skills of like gathering my information, sharing my story, being consistent, asking to speak to the right people. And ultimately, they actually dropped that charge. And so I was really proud of myself for being able to like just advocate for myself, and some of those skills that I use in my professional life, I was able to bring them into my personal life.
That's awesome. That's amazing. I love that for you. Teklii and Arielle J, do you guys have any examples of advocacy you'd like to share that you've done?
Yeah, I mean there are a couple I could think of. Like I remember when I was an undergrad, there were a bunch of us who all wrote letters to our legislators. There were a ton of us. We were all writing about similar things and, being able to see power in numbers. But it's more than just that. I'm speaking more so about like this, like advocating for yourself as a young adult. And for me, that was in college. If I needed an extension on something for some reason, or if I needed services that I wasn't getting access to, then I had to learn pretty quickly that no one else was going to do that for me. And you'd have to talk to teachers or professors or whoever else can get you those things. But, that I will preface that by saying that can be really hard to do by yourself. And I feel like in order to be able to do it effectively, you're probably going to need someone to help you.
That's a really good point. I had to do a lot of advocating for myself in school. It is difficult. It's challenging, especially when you're young, and I was put in a lot of programs to learn how to advocate for myself, so I had that experience, but that was because I had support to help me learn how to do that. But at the same time, at a bigger level of advocacy work, I have been a part of so many things that were considered advocacy that just fell apart or failed or just didn't go through all the way. And like, I'm in the middle of advocacy work right now, and it's really challenging because I'm having the advocacy fatigue. I'm like, I don't want to break from this because I'm really passionate about this, but it's so challenging to stay motivated to keep going when it feels like there's so many things against you.
Yeah, that's real. And yeah, take a break if you need to. And I think it's really important to find joy in other things. And I think that kind of replenishes you a little bit to come back. And I think it also inspires others to be able to do the same. And they're like, oh, she's doing it. Maybe it is okay, right? So we break a little bit of that stigma of like being able to take breaks and focus on yourself.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Lily, was how to get involved with legislative writing.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, most people aren't writing the actual legislative language. There are dedicated teams in the legislatures that write that language, and they're lawyers who know legalese, right? So I would say don't get so hung up on that. I think the way that people do get involved in law writing is just bringing up the challenges and the solutions. And so it could be that somebody spoke to a legislator about an issue and was like, here's what I need to be able to fix it. And the legislator's like, okay, maybe that's a bill idea. So then they work with their staff to write up that bill. I would say it's way more common to share your story, talk to folks, and all of that. And again, like it varies, right? Sometimes you're not going to be able to talk to your alderman or your state legislator or Senator Durbin, who represents everybody in Illinois in Congress. But I think being able to even send an email to their staff or just making a call, I think is a really good way to get in the door and get started. I mean, I think that's why, again, it's important to take breaks, but also just being able to be like, I did my part. Like, that's good enough for today. And hopefully it inspires somebody else to do their part. And, collectively we can create more power and more momentum. But it will never be an immediate change, right? It won't be that you're like, the mental health system doesn't work. It's not affordable. I want you to make it affordable. And the legislator will be like, okay, let me write a bill to make it affordable. And then a month later, you have a bill that says mental health now is affordable. Like, that is not at all how it works. It's going to create a lot of conversations, a lot of momentum, but being able to get that momentum started by saying, I want you to make mental health more affordable is where you come in. You can fan the flames as it progresses. If there's ever a time where like the momentum dies, you're like, actually, well, I talked to you about this, legislator. What happened here? They'd be like, oh, right. Let me get back on that, right? So it's also important to be mindful that advocacy wins take time. I wouldn't let that discourage you. It's just the name of the game, and our role is to, play it.
And I think just going off of what you said, that's so important to remember that there are a lot of roadblocks to change and that a lot of them aren't personal. Because I think if you're just thinking individually, I feel like that's very difficult not to take that personally to an extent. And it's also very hard to keep going.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. Yeah, so I'm curious about Teklii and Arielle, our other panelists here today. What's been your advocacy journey like in getting here?
Personally, the answer is my mom got me involved with advocacy on a I need to advocate for myself way. And then I joined a lot of other organizations where it seemed like a lot of the work that they were doing was, going to board meetings. Like I've gone to board meetings since forever. I don't know if that counts as advocacy, but I'd be a baby and just sit at a school board meeting and just listen to what was going on. Could I understand it? I don't know. Maybe I did. But I joined a couple of boards, so it obviously had some influence on me. And from there, I think I feel better as a supportive person towards advocacy. Like if somebody else is trying to get the word out about something, I'm like, hey, I can help you, because that's just how I feel like I've supported people in my journey when it relates to advocacy. Just because I have received a lot of roadblocks, and I'm on a personal role and then a professional one and then whatever else I feel like I want to be doing. So that's how I kind of got started, I guess. That kind of led me down the path of what advocacy even was to begin with.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing.
I'll say that, like anybody, I feel like we all have need to advocate for ourselves. And we do all start doing that at some point, whether or not we realize it. But unlike Teklii, I don't really feel like I've been very supported in that, even though, I've always had to advocate for myself. I just don't feel like I've really had any of that support. So all of this is still pretty new to me, at least from a personal perspective. Professionally, I've done a little bit here and there. I was very involved in different community service organizations when I was in undergrad and did some stuff in grad school too. But it still just kind of feels a little new to me.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Arielle H, how did you get involved with advocacy?
Mental health advocacy, specifically, just with my role at NAMI. That's how I kind of began that. Like both of you, I imagine, I've been advocating for myself since, like Arielle J said, probably since we were able to, tell people no. A 2-year-old doesn't want a hug from somebody. No, you're advocating for yourself. But in other ways, I have memories of growing up and talking to my mom about something in school that I thought wasn't appropriate to be talking about, in terms of it was a public school and they were trying to talk about religion. And I was like, are you supposed to be doing that? So I remember my mom doing something about it. And then entering the like mental health space and learning about specifically language and like the language we're trying to encourage people to use when talking about mental health. I'm way more aware of that than I was 2 years ago. I make sure that I am using the correct language and advocating for anybody affected by incorrect language by asking other people to avoid certain terms as well. Arielle J, did you have another thing?
Yeah, this was just going off of different examples of advocacy, and I just remembered this. So when I was in like elementary school, I remember there was a substitute teacher that we had that said something super inappropriate. So I remember like telling my mom, and the next day the guy was like banned from school. So I guess if that counts, just to say that like we're young, we're always advocating for ourselves.
Arielle J brings up a great point, the advocacies, not only with mental health, but in other aspects. I used to help out with Girl Scouts, and one of the things that you get a little patch for was advocating. And I think that that's another good experience of advocating at a very young age. It's just doing little things to get involved with that. Because there was a lot of things that you learn as you're growing up, which might be considered advocacy, and you don't even realize it yet.
Does anybody here have any examples that you can think of that you'd like to share of maybe other people advocating on your behalf? Kind of like, talking to our parents when we're young and being like, hey, that was weird, and then they do something about it.
I got one about bullying. When I was in middle school, we had somebody new in our class who was assigned to sit next to me, and they started calling me a disgusting word, and they just kept calling me that over and over again. And I ignored it for a while because it was like in the middle of class. I was just like, dude, you shouldn't do that. But a classmate of mine who I'd been in school with for a very long time got up and said, you don't talk to Teklii like that. You don't call her that. You need to stop using that word. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't think people cared about me like that. I was just living with it because I was like, nobody's done anything so far. Teachers walking around. So I appreciated that they stood up for me in that moment and said, hey, that's not okay. But I've had some really touching moments where I'm just like, it's really nice to advocate for other people. And it's really nice when other people advocate for you and support your goals or support, you speaking out or just pointing out something that maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing or doing or addressing. I have an example of advocacy that someone else can do on someone else's behalf when it comes to their mental health. For example, when someone's having anxiety or are getting nervous about something that we can do as an individual or like their friend is just take the moment and create space for them so that they can feel whatever it is they're feeling, or even say, hey, do you want me to go get someone for you? And then we become the advocates on another person's behalf to be able to say, hey, something's going on with my friend. I want to do what's best for them. So I'm telling you, or like finding a best case scenario of what's going on. And so being a friend to someone can also be a version of advocacy.
That's great. Yeah. And that brings me to next part, which is having some concrete examples on how you, our listeners, and ourselves can be better advocates for change. We've talked quite a bit throughout this episode about different examples of advocacy we've done ourselves, or methods of civic engagement, or other ways to get involved, including voting and correcting language and talking to your legislators and emailing and calling and talking to other people, sharing your story. This is the amazing stuff. Does anybody here have any suggestions on what young people might need to know about advocacy to be more involved? Either something you would have liked to know as a young person or things that you think young people know.
Yeah, I think I wish I had known as a young person that there's so many ways to do it, right? And whether it's like being, again, like participating at a protest or sending an email or signing a petition, like those are all examples of advocacy. I always felt like it had to be like very specific, like writing a bill with the president, and that's the only way advocacy happens. But No, just like taking those little steps in your community. And I think no action is too small. It all leads to other actions. And I think it also inspires others to take action. And I think that's where the sparks really happen, is when, a lot of people decide to take action collectively and then they make something happen.
There is power in numbers, but you have to remember that you are still worth a lot more than just a number.
Yeah, it's important to remember that as a collective or a group, we have a louder voice, but the individual voice is still just as important. But I also love that there are multiple ways to advocate. That's not just, legislative writing or talking to someone. There's different ways that we can get involved.
Yeah, it can look different for every person, and making sure something fits your needs at whatever moment in time so you're not burning out from advocating as well. Thank you all for joining today and sharing your advocacy experiences. It's much appreciated, and I feel like we learned a lot. Don't forget that you too can join our NAMI Illinois Young Adult Work Group if you are between 17 and 27 years old and are interested in becoming an advocate for youth and young adults in our state. Visit our website at namiillinois.org and find our tab space. We have opportunities to speak, present, and get in on the podcast. Also, below in the description, you can find links to resources on mental health advocacy and more about NAMI Illinois. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for listening
To Mental Health Unplugged, Grabbing the Aux.
a NAMI Illinois podcast. Special thank you to our panelists and the National Alliance on Mental Illness Illinois State Organization for their support to emphasize youth and young adult voices. To find out more about the National Alliance on Mental Illness here in Illinois, visit namiillinois.org. That's NAMIILLINOIS.org. If you or someone you know is in a crisis, call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 in the United States. For imminent danger, call 911 and request a crisis intervention trained officer.